Silas Crow grabbed the flour sack from Clara Whitmore's arms and dumped it across the frozen ground, every last pound of it, then turned to face the crowd gathered outside Holt's General Store and laughed. Not a quiet laugh, not even a mean-spirited chuckle, a full, chest-deep, open-throated laugh that bent him at the waist, and the people around him, men who had worked alongside Clara's father, women who had eaten bread Clara had helped grind, they laughed too. Some of them covered their mouths. Most of them didn't bother. "Look at that," Silas said, loud enough for every soul on the road to hear. "Even the flour don't want to be carried by her." Clara stood in the spilled white powder with her hands at her sides and her jaw locked tight. 26 years old. She had learned early that if you cried in front of Silas Crow, you handed him something he would use for the rest of his life. She bent down to gather what she could save. That was when the laughing stopped. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had pressed a hand over the mouth of the whole settlement. Clara didn't look up right away. She was used to silence that meant cruelty was coming. But this silence felt different, heavier, like the air before a storm rolls down from the peaks. She heard boots, slow, deliberate, each step pressing deep into the packed snow. Then a shadow fell over her, wide enough to block what little winter sun there was. And a pair of hands the size of supper plates reached down and lifted the flour sack clean off the ground as if it weighed nothing at all. She looked up. The man standing above her was the largest human being she had ever seen. If you enjoy this story, hit the like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you're new here, subscribe and follow along, because the stories we tell on this channel are ones you won't want to miss a single word of. Now, let's get back to Black Hollow, Montana, 1885, because something is about to change that nobody in this settlement saw coming. The man's name moved through the crowd in a whisper before anyone said it aloud. Griffin Hale. Clara had heard that name exactly once before, spoken by her father in the low, careful voice he reserved for things that commanded respect and unease in equal measure. Griffin Hale was the kind of name that didn't belong to any one story. It belonged to all of them. The man who had spent 3 winters in the northern range without coming down once. The man who had fought a trapper dispute with nothing but a skinning knife and walked away with no injuries the other man could honestly describe. The man whose cabin sat somewhere above the tree line, in a place nobody in Black Hollow had ever gone and come back to talk about with any great confidence. He was, in the language of the settlement, a legend. And legends, in Clara's experience, were usually smaller in person. Griffin Hale was not smaller in person. He stood 6'7" in flat-soled boots that had seen so many seasons the leather had cracked and rehardened like bark. His coat was elk hide, worn on the inside, and it hung open despite the cold in a way that suggested the cold had long since given up trying to bother him. His face was broad and weathered and cut with 2 or 3 scars that had settled into his skin the way old fence posts settle into ground. Just part of the landscape now, unremarkable to anyone who'd been looking at it long enough. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His beard was the kind of beard a man grows when he simply doesn't come across a mirror for several months running. He set the flour sack on Clara's small handcart with one hand. Then he turned and looked at Silas Crow. He didn't say anything yet. He just looked, and something in the quality of that look made Silas take a half step backward before he caught himself and straightened up. "You're in my road," Griffin said. His voice was low. Not theatrical low. Just low the way a river sounds low when you're standing above it on a bank. You know there's a great deal of force underneath it. Silas recovered faster than most men would have. He was practiced at recovered faster. It was the primary skill his father's money had bought him. The ability to pretend that he had never been rattled. "Just having a bit of sport," Silas said, and he smiled the smile that worked on everyone else. "The woman's used to it, aren't you, Clara?" He said it without a question mark. It wasn't a question. It was a reminder of her place, of the distance between them that he believed was permanent and structural and essentially geological. Clara kept her eyes on the cart. She had learned not to answer Silas directly. Answering directly gave him more material. Griffin didn't look at Silas's smile. He looked at the spilled flour still dusting the frozen ground and at the way Clara's hands were moving, quick and practiced and slightly trembling. Not from cold, but from the particular kind of humiliation that you have to stay in motion to survive. How much did you spill? Griffin said. He was talking to Clara now. She blinked. Nobody in Black Hollow asked her direct questions that were meant to be answered. They asked her questions the way you'd aim a stone at a target, for the satisfaction of hitting something, not because they expected the target to respond usefully. About a pound, she said. Maybe less. Holt. Griffin turned toward the store without raising his voice. Put a pound of flour on my account. Old Holt, standing in his doorway with his arms crossed and his expression somewhere between fascinated and nervous, nodded once. Done. Silas laughed again, but it was a shorter sound this time, more careful. Since when does Griffin Hale have accounts anywhere? Thought you didn't come down from the mountain for the company. I don't, Griffin said. He began loading the rest of Clara's supplies onto her cart with efficient, unhurried movements. I came down because I need a wife. The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that doesn't come from shock alone. It comes from a whole settlement of people simultaneously recalculating something they thought they understood. Clara's hands went still. Silas's smile went strange. Griffin straightened up from the cart and looked at Clara directly for the first time. Not at her in the way people in Black Hollow looked at her, which was a look that always contained a verdict, but at her the way you look at something you are actually trying to understand. I've been watching since I came into town this morning, he said. You're the only one who loaded that cart by herself. You're the only one who came out in weather like this without someone to fetch your supplies for you. And you're the only one who didn't step over that split barrel stave on the road. You picked it up and moved it to the side so nobody would trip on it. Clara stared at him. She had no idea what to do with what he was saying. Compliments had always been preceded, in her experience, by a cruelty. The compliment was the wind-up. She was waiting for the throw. It didn't come. I don't know your name, Griffin said. Clara Whitmore. You have family here. My parents, 2 brothers. I'll speak to your father, he said it plain. Not as a request, not as a question. More like a man saying he will go to the water to drink. A thing he has decided and intends to follow through on. A thing that requires only information about direction, not permission. Silas stepped forward. His face had changed in a way that Clara had seen before, in the moments when Silas encountered something that threatened his sense of how the world was arranged. It was not quite anger yet. It was the thing before anger. A tightening. A recalibration. You're serious, Silas said. I don't make declarations I'm not serious about. Silas stopped and looked at Clara. Then he looked back at Griffin and dropped his voice in a way that was somehow worse than if he'd kept it loud. You've been up there alone too long. Come down to the tavern, have a meal. I'll introduce you to women who are actually— I saw those women, Griffin said. They looked away when this one fell. Silas had no immediate response to that. Clara watched something move across his face that she could not quite name. It wasn't embarrassment. Silas didn't do embarrassment. It was something closer to the face of a man who has just discovered that the game he thought he was playing has different rules than he believed, and he needs time to figure out what they are. Clara, Griffin turned back to her. Where does your father live? End of Birch Road, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. The house with the blue shutter on the left side. He nodded. I'll go there this afternoon. He picked up the handle of the handcart, the whole thing, supplies and all, and began walking. After a moment, Clara realized he was walking in the direction of Birch Road, pulling her cart, and she had to move quickly to keep up with him. She didn't look back at Silas. She heard him say something behind her, something low and contemptuous, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't need to hear the words. Whatever Silas said in that moment, it was aimed at a woman who was already walking away. Her father's name was Roy Whitmore, and he was a man who had spent his whole life making practical calculations and convincing himself they were something more principled than that. He had married Clara's mother for her family's land. He had taken the settlement's money to supply the feed barn, even when he knew the hay was going damp. He had raised 2 sons who understood that the world rewarded confidence and charm, and 1 daughter who understood neither, and he had long since decided that the daughter's failure to understand these things was her own character defect and not a product of anything he had or hadn't done. He opened the door when Griffin knocked and took about 4 full seconds to process what he was looking at. "Roy Whitmore," Griffin said. It wasn't a greeting, it was an identification. "That's right," Roy said carefully. "My name is Griffin Hale. I've come to discuss your daughter." Roy's eyes moved to Clara, standing just behind and to the side of Griffin, and then back to Griffin, and Clara could see her father doing arithmetic. The kind of arithmetic he always did, the calculation of what this meant for him, what it cost, what it gained, which direction the advantage lay. "Come in," Roy said. The house was warm from the fire, and it smelled like the soup her mother had been making since morning, and Clara's mother, a small, worn woman named Dora, who had given up most of her opinions sometime in the 1870s, appeared from the kitchen doorway and froze at the sight of Griffin the way a deer freezes before it decides whether to run. "Sit down," Roy said. Griffin sat. The chair groaned. He seemed unconcerned by this. "You're the mountain man," Roy said. "Hale." "Yes." "What exactly is it you want with Clara?" Griffin looked at Clara first. She was standing near the door with her coat still on, and he said, "Sit down, Clara," before he said anything else, as though her comfort in this conversation was something he considered relevant, which was not a thing Roy Whitmore had ever suggested. Clara sat. "I need a wife who can survive the mountain," Griffin said. He didn't dress it up. He talked the way he moved, without wasted motion. "Most women from settlements can't. They're not built for it. Or they are built for it, but they've had every piece of that buried under drawing rooms and dinner parties until it's gone." He paused. "Your daughter is built for it. I can see that. She hasn't had it buried. You haven't given her the chance for that." Roy's jaw tightened. "Now listen here." "I'm not insulting you," Griffin said, and somehow the absence of emotion in his voice made it more effective, not less. "I'm telling you what I observed. I watched her in town this morning. She doesn't quit, and she doesn't ask for help, and she doesn't fold when someone is cruel to her. Those are traits I need." "The mountain," Roy said slowly. "You mean you'd take her up there to live?" "Yes." Roy looked at Dora. Dora looked at her hands. "For how long?" Roy said. "Permanently." There was a silence. Clara watched her father's face and understood what was happening in it. She had been watching her father's face her whole life, and she was very good at reading it by now. He was calculating. He was measuring the cost of feeding her, housing her, the embarrassment of her continued presence in a settlement where his sons were trying to establish themselves, against the cleanliness of this, against having the matter resolved, against being able to tell people, if they asked, that his daughter had married and gone north. "What would you offer?" Roy said. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. 50 pounds of dried elk," Griffin said. 20 of bear. A full winter supply of pelts, fox, beaver, marten. And I'll fix your barn roof before I leave. I saw it coming up the road. Another winter, and you'll lose it." Roy Whitmore nodded slowly. The calculation was complete. The answer was yes. "Clara," he looked at her. "You'll go." It was not a question. "When?" she said. Her voice was flat. She was not going to give either of them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "Tomorrow morning," Griffin said. "We need to reach the first ridge before the weather turns." He looked at her, not past her, not through her, directly at her, and said something that no one in that house had ever said to her in quite that way. "Bring what you need. We won't be coming back for anything you forget." Clara nodded once. She stood up. She walked to her room, the small room at the back of the house with the window that stuck in winter and the quilt her grandmother had made before Clara was born, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dimming afternoon light and thought about what she needed. She had one bag. It didn't take long. That night, her brother Daniel found her packing. Daniel was 23 and handsome in the easy way of men who have never been told they weren't, and he stood in the doorway of her room with his shoulder against the frame and watched her fold her spare dress into the bag. "You don't have to go," he said. Clara looked up. "Papa said I do." "Papa says a lot of things." "He's not wrong this time." She went back to folding. "I've been in this house 26 years, Daniel. I don't think either of us would call that a success." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "You don't know anything about that man." "I know he's the only person who picked up my flour sack today." "That could mean a lot of things." "It means exactly one thing," Clara said. "He thought it was worth picking up." She closed the bag and buckled it and set it by the door. Daniel watched her do this with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite concern, but lived somewhere in the narrow territory between them. Clara had seen that expression on his face before. It came out when the accumulated weight of small cruelties that he'd allowed, that he'd laughed at, or failed to stop, or simply walked away from, became briefly, uncomfortably visible to him. "It's cold up there," he said. "It's cold here," she said. She blew out the lamp. Griffin came for her at first light. He had a horse, a big dark bay with a winter coat already thick, and a disposition that suggested it had been up the mountain several times, and had opinions about the experience. He had a second horse as well, a shorter, sturdier animal with saddlebags already loaded, and he handed Clara the lead rope of the second one without ceremony. "Can you ride?" he said. "Enough," she said. "Good enough is fine." They left Black Hollow in the gray light before the settlement woke. Clara looked back once. The houses sat quiet and small, and smoke was just beginning to curl from a few chimneys. She had lived inside those boundaries her whole life. She could draw the roads from memory. She knew whose dog barked at what hour, and whose children played where, and which families were kind and which ones weren't, and she was leaving all of it behind in the company of a man she had known for less than a day. She turned back around. She did not look back again. But the trail north out of Black Hollow was maintained for about 4 miles, packed down by enough wagon and foot traffic to stay passable. And then it became something else. Not a road, not quite a path. More like a suggestion, a scar on the landscape left by people who had gone this way for reasons that no longer applied to anyone currently alive. Griffin rode without speaking for the first hour. Clara did the same. She was not someone who filled silence out of nervousness, and she got the impression he appreciated this, or at least that he was accustomed to silence in a way that made him neutral about it. It was when the suggestion of a trail bent north by northeast, and the trees closed in and the temperature dropped in the specific way it drops, when you've climbed enough elevation to leave one kind of cold behind and enter another, that he said without turning around, "You haven't asked me anything?" "I will when I have questions," Clara said. He looked back at her over his shoulder. "Most people have questions." "Most people asked them yesterday when there were still other options," she said. "I'm past that point." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but a loosening. Like a door that's been shut a long time, moving slightly on its hinges. "Fair," he said. They rode. The trail climbed. The trees, lodgepole pines and fir, and here and there a larch still holding a few copper needles from the fall, pressed closer on both sides until the sky was a narrow seam above them, gray-white with weather that hadn't decided yet what it was going to do. "How far is it?" Clara asked. 2 days in good conditions." "And in these conditions?" "Depends on tonight." He looked at the sky the way people who've spent time outside look at it, reading it, not observing it. "If the weather holds through dark, we make the first shelter by midday tomorrow. If it doesn't hold," he paused, "we'll manage." The deliberate understatement of "will manage" struck Clara somewhere she couldn't name. People in Black Hollow did not say "will manage" to her. They said "can she manage," as though her management of any situation was always a question rather than a given. The pronoun felt different, the we. She filed it away and kept riding. By noon, the trail had narrowed to single file, and the horses were breathing hard at the grade. Clara's thighs ached from the saddle in the way they hadn't since she was a girl and used to ride the plow horse along the fence line for no reason other than to be somewhere else for an hour. She shifted her weight and kept her balance and didn't complain, because there was no one to complain to and the complaint wouldn't change the hill. Griffin stopped at a creek crossing, barely more than a trickle under a skim of ice, and let both horses drink and blow. "Eat something," he said, handing her a strip of dried meat from his coat pocket. She took it. It was dense and strongly flavored with smoke and something she couldn't identify, and it was probably the best thing she'd eaten since the previous fall when her mother had made venison stew before the good cuts ran out. "Your cabin," she said. "How long have you had it?" Built it 8 years ago. By yourself? Yes. How? He looked at her. One log at a time. I mean, why? Why up there and not down here? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek, at the way the horses were still drinking with the patient, methodical absorption of animals that don't think about anything beyond the immediate good thing in front of them. You know what people in settlements do, he said finally. They look at you and they decide what you are. And once they've decided, there's no undeciding them. Doesn't matter what you do after that. They've already got the story written. Clara said nothing. She knew exactly what people in settlements did. Up there, he said, nodding northward at the peaks, there's no one to write any stories. There's just the mountain and the weather and the work. And you find out pretty fast what you actually are, because there's nothing else around to tell you what you should be. He clicked his tongue at the horses, and they lifted their heads, and the crossing continued. Clara chewed her dried meat and thought about what he'd said, and decided it was the most honest thing anyone had told her in longer than she could accurately remember. They made camp before dark in a hollow that Griffin clearly knew, a depression in the hillside sheltered on 3 sides by a natural rock formation with a fire ring of stones already arranged from a previous visit and a dry cache of wood tucked under an overhang. Griffin started the fire with an efficiency Clara found almost offensive. It was so practiced and easy. He had the horses staked and the supplies organized and the fire going before she'd finished unsaddling her own mount. And he didn't comment on the difference in their speed, which she appreciated. She settled beside the fire and worked the stiffness out of her hands. The light was going fast up here, faster than in the valley, the peaks eating the sun earlier, and the cold that came with the dark was immediate and serious. "You're not what I expected," she said. He was arranging a small pan over the fire. "What did you expect?" "I don't know, something—" She thought about it. "Rougher." "I'm rough," he said. "Maybe, but rough in the way things are rough when they've been shaped by something. Not rough in the way things are rough when they've never been shaped at all." He looked at her across the fire. The light made the scars on his face more visible, which made them less remarkable somehow. She was getting used to them faster than she expected. "What shaped you?" he said. Clara almost laughed. "Ask anyone in Black Hollow." "I'm asking you." She looked at the fire for a moment. "Same thing that shapes most people, I suppose. Being told what you are until you either believe it or decide you don't." She paused. "I've been working on the deciding part." "How's that going?" "Slowly." He put the pan on the stones and straightened up and looked at her the way he'd looked at her in front of Holt's store, the actually trying to understand look, not the verdict look, and said, "You lifted that flour sack twice your own weight this morning and loaded it alone onto a cart in freezing weather, and the only thing that stopped you was Silas Crow being what he is." "Crow's always been what he is. Men like that are. You know him." "I know the type." His voice didn't change when he said it, but something behind his eyes did. A flatness, something closed and still. "Grew up around the type. The kind of man who doesn't feel big unless there's someone smaller for him to stand on." Clara looked at him. "What did you do about it? When you were younger?" A pause. "Things I'm not proud of," he said. "And then I came up the mountain." She didn't push further. There were stories in those scars that she didn't have the right to yet, and she understood that, and she let it sit. They ate in comfortable quiet, and the fire talked for them. The pop and hiss, an occasional crack of the wood doing what fires do. And Clara sat close enough to feel the heat on her face and looked up at the stars appearing in the strip of sky above the hollow, thick and cold and indifferent and magnificent, and thought, "I have never in my life been this far from everything I have ever known." And then, surprising herself, "I don't mind it." Ooh. The second morning came with ice on the horses' blankets and a sky that had gone low and gray while they slept, full of something that hadn't decided whether it was going to be snow or just threat. Griffin looked at it for a long moment when he came out of his bedroll. "We move fast today," he said. They did. The trail on the second day was not a trail anymore in any conventional sense. It was a line of judgment, the way you go when you know a landscape well enough to read it, rather than follow a marked path. the instinctive angles and switchbacks of someone who has made this ascent many times. Griffin moved with a certainty that Clara found she was able to follow if she kept her eyes on his horse's hindquarters and trusted his judgment over her own eyes, which told her twice that they were going the wrong direction before being proven incorrect. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be. Her legs, already sore from the previous day, had settled into a deep, bone-level ache that she recognized from the winters she'd spent carrying grain sacks in the barn. The ache of a body doing work it hasn't been asked to do before. Not in exactly this way, on exactly these muscles. She didn't say anything. Griffin stopped on a ridge and waited for her to come alongside. From here she could see below them, Black Hollow, impossibly distant and small, the whole settlement reduced to a smudge of smoke and geometry in the White Valley. "Last look," he said. Clara looked at it for a moment. She thought about her mother's hands. She thought about the room with the stuck window. She thought about the spilled flour catching the morning light on the frozen ground and the sound of laughter. "All right," she said and looked away. They rode on. The snow started around midday, not the thin decorative snow of low elevations, but the real thing, the horizontal thing, the kind of snow that arrives with a sense of purpose and intention that tells you clearly that it is not interested in your plans or your timeline and will complete its business on its own schedule. Griffin's pace didn't change. Clara pulled her collar up and leaned forward over her horse's neck and focused on the animal's footfalls. Steady, careful, choosing footing with the considered attention of a creature that understood falls on a slope like this would be serious. "How much farther?" she asked, raising her voice over the wind. "Hour," Griffin called back. "Maybe less if the snow stays light." It did not stay light. By the time the cabin materialized out of the white, first as a shape, then as a specific shape, then as a structure with a door and a chimney and a lean-to shelter for the animals, Clara's hands had gone past cold to the stage, beyond cold, where you stop feeling them entirely and just hope they still work when you need them. Griffin had the horses under cover in minutes. He moved around the lean-to without rushing and without wasting motion, doing the things that clearly needed doing in the order they clearly needed doing, and Clara followed behind him, watching how he worked, taking note. This was how things were done here, and she was going to learn them. "Inside," he said when the animals were settled. "There's wood stacked by the door. I'll get the fire going." She started for the door. Then her boot caught on something, a root, a stone, some edge beneath the snow she couldn't see, and she went down hard, one knee and both hands into the snow. Not a graceful stumble, a full drop. She stayed there for just a moment, one breath, two, with her palms flat on the cold ground and the snow falling around her. She waited for the comment, the laugh, the look. 26 years of falling down had trained her to wait for what came after. Griffin crouched beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, "Ice under the snow there, I should have warned you. That corner collects it." He put his hand under her arm and helped her up, which he did efficiently and without making a production of it. And then he said, "I'll mark it so you know." And that was the entirety of it. No embarrassment, no pity, no performance, just information. Clara stood upright in the falling snow in front of this man's cabin at the edge of a wilderness she'd never known, and felt something shift inside her chest. Small, quiet. The shift of something that has been pressed down for a very long time, moving, slightly, back toward where it was supposed to be. She went inside. The cabin was one main room with a loft overhead. Everything rough-hewn and purposeful, nothing decorative. The walls chinked against the weather. A stone fireplace on the north wall with a proper stone hearth swept clean. It was cold inside because it had been empty, but it was shelter, real shelter, and Clara stood in the middle of it and looked around with the eyes of a woman who had spent 26 years being told she was too much and not enough simultaneously, and who was now standing in a place that had been built by hand, one log at a time, out of nothing but necessity and effort. She thought, "I can work with this." She found the wood by the door and she started building the fire before Griffin came in from the lean-to, and when he entered and found her crouched at the hearth coaxing the tinder into something that meant it, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "You know fires," he said. "I know most things if someone shows me once," she said. "Nobody showed me fires. I figured those out myself." He came inside and shut the door against the storm. "Good," he said. And the wind screamed along the eaves and the fire caught, and the cabin filled with the particular quality of warmth that only exists in small shelters in big storms, warmth that means something because of what's outside. And Clara Whitmore, who had never in her life been anywhere anyone considered her worth keeping, held her hands out to the growing fire and very quietly began to believe she might stay. The fire held through the night. Clara knew this because she woke twice to feed it. Not because Griffin asked her to, not because anyone had assigned her the task, but because she had learned early in life that the things worth keeping required tending, and a fire in a mountain cabin during a storm was not a thing you left to chance. She rose in the dark without lighting a lamp, found the wood by feel, fed the fire what it needed, and went back to her bedroll on the floor beside the hearth, while Griffin slept in the loft above without stirring. She lay there in the firelight for a while before sleeping again, listening to the storm work itself against the cabin walls. It had a serious quality, this storm. Not the kind that arrived dramatically and burned itself out fast, but the slow, methodical kind that settled in like a difficult guest and made clear it intended to stay. The wind found every imperfection in the chinking and pushed cold air through it in thin, insistent streams. The roof timbers talked. The horses and the lean-to were audible sometimes when the wind shifted, and their presence, those ordinary animal sounds, the shift and stamp of hooves, was more comforting than it had any logical right to be. She slept. In the morning, the storm had not stopped, but had become consistent enough that Griffin considered it manageable, and he went out to tend the horses and assess the snow depth while Clara made use of the small iron stove in the corner that served as the cooking apparatus. He had stores, a surprising amount of them, organized along the back wall with a tidiness that suggested a man who understood that disorder in a place this remote had real consequences. Dried beans, dried corn, salt, a crock of bear lard, smoked meat hanging from the ceiling in cloth bags, root vegetables in a box of dry sand. She found what she needed for a morning porridge, and had it ready when the door opened and the wind pushed him back inside with a face reddened by cold and a dusting of snow in his beard. He stopped. He looked at the stove. He looked at the tin cups she'd found on the shelf and filled with water from the barrel. He looked at her standing at the stove, stirring with a wooden spoon she'd found hanging on a nail. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I was awake," she said. "Sit down." He sat. He pulled off his gloves and folded them and set them on the table and looked at the bowl she put in front of him with an expression that was hard to read at first. And then Clara understood it, because she had seen it before in only one other context, which was the faces of animals that had been without food long enough to have stopped expecting it. He was surprised to be fed. Not the surprised of a man who is unused to cooking for himself. He had clearly managed, but the surprised of a man who is unused to someone else considering that he might be hungry. He ate. Clara ate across the table from him, and neither of them spoke for a few minutes, and the storm said everything that needed to be said in the meantime. "How long will it last?" she asked, meaning the snow. "Another day, maybe two. And then we work." He set his spoon down. "The lean-to needs a second wall on the north side before the serious cold comes. I've got the timber cut and stacked, just needs to go up. There's a smoke hole in the back wall of the cabin needs re-chinking before we lose more heat through it. Traps need running when the weather breaks. And," he paused, "I need to know what you can do." Clara looked at him steadily. "Ask. Can you skin and cure?" "Yes." "Cook on a fire in a stove?" "Yes, both." "Sew, real sewing, not just mending." "My grandmother was a seamstress. I'm not as good as she was, but I'm competent." "Can you handle a rifle?" "A beat." "I've never fired one." "That'll change," he said without judgment. "Anything you've never done but think you could learn." Clara thought about it honestly. "Most things," she said, "as long as someone shows me the right way to do it first. I don't do well learning from my mistakes when the mistakes have serious consequences." The corner of his mouth moved. "That's the sanest thing anyone said to me in 3 years." "Who was the last person you talked to for 3 years?" "Trapper named Eccles, who came through in the spring of '83. He wasn't what I'd call a good conversationalist." "What happened to him?" "He moved on. Trappers do." He picked up his spoon again. "I don't know what happened to him after that." Clara nodded. She had a dozen more questions, but she was rationing them. She had learned a long time ago that the people who gave you real information about themselves did it in their own time, and that pressing for it faster than they were willing to give it was a reliable way to get no information at all. They finished breakfast. Clara washed the bowls in the water barrel while Griffin studied something in a worn notebook. Columns of numbers, she thought, though she didn't look closely. And the storm continued its argument with the mountain, and the cabin held. The second day was worse for weather and better for almost everything else. Worse because the snow that fell was the wet, heavy kind that accumulated fast and put serious weight on the lean-to roof, and required Griffin to go out twice and clear it with a long-handled wooden rake he kept beside the door specifically for this purpose. Clara went with him the second time, taking the rake when he handed it to her and working her half of the roof while he worked his. And if he was surprised that she didn't offer an opinion about whether she ought to be outside in this, he didn't show it. Better because something loosened between them that second day, and the way things loosen when two people are stuck in a small space together and discover they can exist in it without the existence being painful. She learned that he was meticulous in specific ways and careless in others. The traps and tools were maintained with a jeweler's attention, the firewood was stacked with geometric precision, but his clothes had 3 different rips in them that he'd been meaning to get to and hadn't, and there was a corner of the cabin where things got put when they didn't have an obvious home that had accumulated into a pile of significant archaeological complexity. He learned that she didn't need to fill silence, and that she meant what she said without softening it first, and that she had a capacity for sustained physical work that she wore lightly, the way people wear things they've never been complimented on because no one thought to notice. It was on the afternoon of the second day, when the wind had dropped enough that the interior of the cabin felt almost quiet by comparison, that he told her something she hadn't asked for. He was at the table working on a trap mechanism that had been sticking, and she was sewing a tear in the elk hide she'd found folded on a shelf, and he said without preamble, "My wife died." Clara's hands went still on the leather. 4 years ago, he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the trap, working the mechanism with his thumb while he talked, and the click-click of the metal was the only sound while he continued. She was from a settlement in the Bitterroot. We had 2 years up here. She was capable. She understood what the mountain was. A pause. She died in a spring flood. The creek below the East Ridge came up fast and she was crossing it. Clara said nothing. She waited. "I went looking," he said. "Spent 3 days. Found her downstream." Another pause, longer. "I buried her on the south slope where the sun gets to it in January. Even January." He set the trap down. He picked it up again. "I'm telling you this," he said, because I think you should know why I came down when I did. It wasn't because I'd been alone long enough to get reckless about it. It was because I'd been alone long enough to understand that the mountain doesn't care who you are or what you know or how prepared you thought you were. And I am careful about this place. I am careful about the people I bring into it." He looked at her now. "I want you to know that I didn't choose poorly before, and I don't intend to now." Claire set down the leather and the needle. "What was her name?" she said. "Margaret. She sounds like she was someone worth knowing." He looked at her for a moment. His expression was not grief exactly. Grief was something acute, and he had clearly moved past that stage into the place beyond, which was quieter and permanent. "She was," he said. "I'm sorry you lost her," Clara said. Straight, no performance. He nodded once. He picked up the trap again. Clara picked up the leather and the needle. They worked in silence, and the silence was different from before. Not the silence of two people being careful with each other, but the silence of two people who had just exchanged something real and were giving it room to settle. The storm broke on the morning of the third day, and the world outside the cabin was enormous and white and blinding under a sky that had gone hard blue and savage with sunlight, and the cold was of a clarity and seriousness that Clara had no previous frame of reference for. "Dress in everything you have," Griffin told her. She did. 2 pairs of wool socks, every layer she'd packed, her coat over all of it. He handed her a pair of mittens, heavy, fur-lined, that were far too large for her hands. "Mine," he said. "Better than nothing." They went outside. He showed her the trap line first, not in the sense of teaching her every specific. That would take time, many iterations, and he seemed to understand this, but in the sense of walking her through the logic of it. Where the animals moved and why. What signs to look for in the snow. How close to a water source you could work without the scent of the traps reaching the wrong places. He talked while he walked, and she listened with the full attention of someone who understood this information mattered in a real and practical way, which he seemed to notice. At the third trap, empty, not sprung, needing adjustment, he stopped and said, "Here, watch this." She watched. "Now do it," he said. She did it wrong the first time, felt the mechanism give in the wrong direction under her mittened hands. "Take the mitten off," he said. She did. The cold was immediate and serious on her fingers. "You need to feel where it's seated," he said, and he guided her hands not with the tentative touch of a man uncertain about whether to touch her at all, but with the direct functional contact of one person positioning another person's hands where they needed to be, and Clara found the seat of the mechanism and set it correctly, and Griffin said, "Good," and she put the mitten back on. Her fingers ached for the next hour. She didn't mention it. They ran the full line by midday. 2 fox, 1 marten. Griffin dispatched them quickly and without theatrical efficiency. Just the practiced final motion of a man who had done this long enough that it had become part of his body rather than a decision he made. He showed Clara how to carry them. She carried them without comment. On the way back, cutting east through a stand of larch, he stopped abruptly and held up a hand. Clara stopped. She didn't speak. He was listening to something she couldn't identify yet. Her ears were still learning this place, learning to distinguish the sounds that mattered from the sounds that were always there. She watched his face instead, reading what she could from it. His jaw tightened. "Someone's on the ridge," he said quietly. "How can you tell?" "Snow falling from that tree," he said, barely moving his lips. "Wind's not right for it to fall on its own." Clara looked at the tree he meant without turning her head fully. She could see the small release of snow from a lower branch. Barely anything. She never would have noticed it without him pointing it out. "Could be an animal," she said, equally quiet. "Could be," he said, but the way it fell. He was already moving, not running, not even fast, but with the particular purposeful quiet of a man whose body had learned how to move through snow without sounding like a man moving through snow. "Come close behind me." She did. They moved through the larches in a long arc that brought them to the base of the ridge from the south side rather than the east, and when they climbed the last few feet to the ridge line and looked over, there was nothing there. No animal. No man. Boot prints in the snow, though, 2 sets, overlapping, going north. Griffin crouched and looked at them for a long moment. "Recent," he said. "Who would be up here?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the prints with an expression that had flattened into something Clara had not seen on his face before. Not worry, calculation. "Nobody with any honest purpose," he said. He stood. He looked north, where the prints went, and then he looked back at the way they'd come, toward the cabin. "We go back," he said. "Now." She didn't argue. They moved fast, and fast at altitude in deep snow is a different animal entirely from fast anywhere else. It was lung-burning and leg-destroying, and by the time the cabin appeared through the trees, Clara was breathing in ragged pulls that steamed and froze as fast as they left her mouth, and her legs had gone past ache into a bright, specific pain in the meat of both thighs that she was going to feel for days. She didn't slow down. When they reached the cabin, Griffin went inside first and checked the interior with a systematic brevity that told her he'd had reason to do this before in his life. Checked the loft, checked the back wall, checked the storage. Everything undisturbed. He came back to the main room and stood with his hands on his hips and his face doing the flat calculation thing again. "You have enemies up here," Clara said. It was not a question. "I have property," he said. "That's enough for some men." "The fortune," she said. She'd heard Silas use the word yesterday in Black Hollow, in that lowered voice, and she'd held on to it. "Silas Crow mentioned you had a fortune." Griffin turned and looked at her. "What exactly did Crow say?" He started to say something when he saw you'd chosen me. He stopped himself. She paused. He was calculating something. I could see it. Griffin was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the far corner of the cabin, the archaeological complexity corner, she thought irrelevantly, and moved a section of wall plank that she now saw was not fixed in the way the others were, but seated in a channel, and behind it was a space roughly the size of a small cupboard lined with oilcloth. He looked at her over his shoulder. "I'm going to show you this," he said, "because if something happens to me, you need to know where it is and what it is." Clara walked over and looked. Gold. Not a fortune in the dramatic sense of the word, not a chest of coins from a story, but a collection of raw placer gold in cloth bags, and 2 veins of ore samples, and a folded document that turned out to be, when he handed it to her, a survey map covered in Griffin's own handwriting with notation she didn't yet understand. 8 years, he said. "I didn't come up here just for the trapping." Clara looked at the map. She looked at the gold. She looked at him. "Who else knows?" she said. "Nobody living that I trust." He reseated the plank. "A man named Purcell helped me with the first survey. He died 2 winters ago. Natural causes, as far as I know." A pause that told her the "as far as I know" was doing significant work. "But Purcell talked when he drank. I've spent 8 years not knowing how much he talked. And you think Silas Crow— I don't know. Crow has connections to the land office in Helena. If Purcell talked to the wrong person and that person talked to Crow," he shook his head. "It's possible. I've been watching the ridge for 2 seasons for signs of someone taking interest. Those boot prints are the first sign I've found." Clara stood in the middle of the cabin and thought about this carefully and deliberately. The way she thought about most things. Not rushing to an opinion, not letting alarm move faster than reason. "The people who would come for this," she said, "they wouldn't come straight at you." "No," he agreed. "They'd watch first, learn your patterns, your schedule, how you run the trap line." She paused. "Which means they've been watching for a while, which means they know you came to town and they saw you with me." Griffin looked at her. "Yes." "So they know you have someone here now, someone who changes your patterns." She met his eyes. "Which is either a complication for them or an opportunity." The silence in the cabin had weight. "You think like someone who's survived something," Griffin said. "I have survived something," she said. 26 years of it." He nodded slowly. There was something in his face that wasn't quite respect. Respect was too clean a word for it, but was in the neighborhood of respect, was a thing you'd find if you looked in the area around respect. "Tonight," he said, "I want to show you where the rifle is kept, and the second rifle, and how to fire them." "I told you I'd never fired one." "I know what you told me." He moved toward the hearth to build up the fire, which had gone low while they were out. "I also watched you set the trap mechanism correctly on your first try with cold fingers in the middle of nowhere on a mountain you've never been on before." He crouched at the fireplace and reached for the wood. "You'll learn the rifle in a day." Clara looked at the hidden plank in the wall. She thought about the boot prints in the snow. She thought about Silas Crow's face in that moment when his smile had gone strange, the face of a man who had just discovered something he wanted and was beginning to think about how to take it. She thought about how she had spent her whole life being told she was too much in some ways and not enough in others, and how she had internalized that for so long that it had become a kind of weather inside her, just always there, just the baseline condition of being herself. And she thought about how this man, in 3 days and 2 nights, had simply not dismantled that. It wasn't dismantled. It was still there. But he kept acting as though it wasn't the governing fact of everything, and that was a different thing, and she was still figuring out what to do with it. "I'll need to see the sights adjusted," she said. "My right eye is stronger than my left." He looked back at her from the fireplace. "I can do that. And I'll need to know how you want me to handle it if someone comes when you're on the trap line and I'm alone here. We'll talk about that too. Tonight," she said. "Before I sleep. I don't like having incomplete information when I'm the one holding the rifle." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "Tonight," he agreed. The fire caught and grew, and the blue afternoon light came through the 2 small windows, and lay in rectangles on the rough floor, and Clara Whitmore took off Griffin Hale's 2 large mittens and held her hands out to the growing warmth, and understood, clearly and without sentimentality, that the life she was living now was more dangerous in obvious ways than the life she had lived before, and less dangerous in the ways that had been quietly killing her for years. She understood something else, too, standing in that cabin with the fire building behind her and the cold still in her coat from the miles they'd covered, and the boot prints fresh in her mind. She was not going to be a problem for this man to manage. She was going to be the thing that helped him survive. She wasn't sure yet whether she believed she was capable of that, but she was going to find out, and she had enough honesty about herself to recognize that the finding out part, the trying, the failing part way, and getting it right the second time, the slow accumulation of competence in a place that required it, was something she had been waiting for her whole life without knowing that's what she was waiting for. The fire settled, the cabin warmed. Outside, the mountain kept its own counsel, patient and enormous and utterly indifferent to anything so small as the 2 people inside the cabin beginning, quietly and without announcement, to trust each other. And north of the ridge, somewhere in the trees where the snow had fallen wrong from a larch branch, whoever had been standing there was already gone. But not, Clara thought, gone far. He adjusted the rifle sights on a Tuesday, 3 days after the boot prints. Clara knew it was Tuesday because she had started keeping a tally on the inside of the doorframe with a piece of charcoal, not from any particular need to track the date, but because she was a person who needed to know where she stood in things, and time was one of them. Griffin had seen her make the first mark and said nothing about it, which she took as permission, or at least as the absence of objection. The adjustment took him 10 minutes with a small iron tool he kept in a leather roll with his other precise instruments. He handed the rifle to Clara when he was done, and they went outside into the cold white morning, and he set a piece of dark bark against the snow on the slope 20 yards out and stepped back. "Shoulder first," he said. "Get the stock seated before you think about anything else. If it's not seated right, the kick will tell you so." She put it to her shoulder. "Lower," he said. "You're holding it like it might bite you." "It might." "It will if you hold it wrong. Lower, cheek to the stock." She adjusted. He moved behind her and put 2 fingers on her right elbow and lifted it slightly. Again, that direct functional contact, nothing apologetic about it. And the whole geometry of her arms and shoulders changed, and she felt immediately that this was different, more stable, less like holding something dangerous and more like being part of a mechanism. "Now," he said. She fired. The bark jumped off the slope, not centered, but hit. She lowered the rifle and looked at where it had been. "Again," he said, and reloaded it for her. "Same target, different piece of bark. Don't think about the first shot." She fired again. Better. She could feel the difference herself. He moved beside her and looked at the slope. "You're pulling right on the exhale," he said. "Hold your breath for the last half second, after the exhale, before the next inhale. Fire in the stillness." "Fire in the stillness," she repeated. "Yes." Third shot. The bark didn't just jump, it split. Griffin stood beside her in the quiet aftermath of the shot, the echo of it still moving away through the trees, and he said, "That's it. That's what you're doing when it's right. Remember that feeling." Clara lowered the rifle and held it properly at her side. She'd learned that already, the safe carry, the direction of the muzzle, the relationship between the weapon and the world around her that required constant low-level awareness. And she remembered the feeling, the stillness inside the cold, the held breath, the moment before. "What do I do if someone comes to the cabin when you're on the line?" she said. He had been expecting this question. She could tell by the way he didn't pause to gather his thoughts. "Warning shot first, over their head. If they don't stop, you fire to hit." "Where?" "Wherever you can. The best target is the largest one." A pause. "You aim for center and you don't hesitate. The hesitation is what gets people killed." "Have you killed someone?" she said. A longer pause this time. "Yes." She didn't ask more than that. She asked the things she needed to know. "Could you tell me where the line is? Between when to fire and when to wait?" He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't give her a quick answer just to have something to say. "If they're coming at you and they're armed and they've already seen the warning," he said, "there's no more line. It's already been crossed." Clara nodded. She handed him the rifle and went back inside to start the midday meal. And she thought about lines, about the difference between a line that you draw and a line that the world draws for you. And she thought that she understood what he meant, and that understanding it in theory was a very different thing from what her body would do when the moment actually came. She was going to have to trust her body. She wasn't sure yet if she did. The boot prints came back in the second week. Not on the ridge this time. Lower, east of the cabin, in the stand of young aspen that grew along the drainage. Griffin found them on a Thursday morning and came back to the cabin with his face in its flat calculation mode and told her, and Clara stood at the table where she'd been salting a hide and absorbed the information. "How many?" she said. "2 sets again. Maybe the same men, maybe not. Hard to tell." "How close to the cabin?" "Quarter mile." She set the salting brush down. "They're measuring." "Yes." "The trap line runs east." "Yes." "So they know your pattern now. They know you're east in the mornings." He looked at her. "Yes." "Which means," she said, "they know I'm alone in the mornings." The cabin was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was in the pines, and the sound it made was different from the wind in the open. Softer, more continuous, like something breathing. "I'm going to change the line," he said. "Run it differently. Go north first, come east late, mix it up so there's no reliable pattern." "That'll work for a while," Clara said. She picked up the brush again and went back to the hide. "What happens when they get impatient?" Griffin pulled out his notebook, the columns of numbers, and sat down at the table. He didn't answer immediately, which was his way of saying that he was taking the question seriously rather than dismissing it. "I've been thinking," he said, "about going to Milford." Milford was the nearest town of any size, bigger than Black Hollow, 3 days south by a different trail, with a land office and a telegraph, and more relevant, a territorial marshal's office. Griffin had mentioned it once before in passing. "For the marshal," Clara said, "for the marshal, and for the land recording. If I file the claim properly in Milford, full documentation, witnessed, recorded with the office, then there's nothing to gain by taking the gold, because anyone who tried to mine it would be operating against a filed claim with the territory." "Unless they filed first," Clara said, "using Purcell's survey." He looked at her sharply. "That's what they're doing, isn't it?" she said. "They're not just here to steal the gold. They're here to confirm the location so they can file a competing claim. They need to find the actual site." She set the brush down again. "They've seen the survey map, or heard enough about it to know there's something to find, but they don't know exactly where the veins are." Griffin was very still. "You've been thinking about this already," she said. "Parts of it," he said. "The part you haven't said yet is that you can't go to Milford and leave me here alone," she said. "And you can't take me with you because then the cabin is empty and they'd search it and find the hidden stores." He set the notebook down. "Yes," he said. "That's the part I haven't said." Clara looked at the far wall, at the plank that didn't look different from the others unless you knew what you were looking for. She thought about the cloth bags of raw gold behind it, and the survey map in Griffin's handwriting, and the 8 years of solitary work that it represented. She thought about what would happen if 2 men with no honest purpose and plenty of impatient motivation found that plank while she was alone in the cabin with a rifle she'd been shooting for 10 days. "Move it," she said. "What?" "Move it. Not the gold necessarily. Move the map. If they find the hiding place and the gold is there, that's one problem. If they find the map, that's a different problem, and worse." She looked at him. "The map tells them where to file. The gold just tells them there's gold." He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the actually trying to understand look. "Where would you put it?" he said. "Somewhere that looks like it couldn't hold anything. The place your eye goes past." She looked around the cabin. "That loose stone at the base of the east chimney column. I noticed it the first morning. It looked like settling, but it's too regular for settling." He stared at her. "I put that in 4 years ago." "I know," she said, "but I don't know what's in it." He got up and went to the fireplace and pressed the stone in a way she could see, sideways, not in, and it shifted to reveal a cavity about the size of a hat box. It held a tin box that he opened to show her, territorial documents, a promissory note of some kind, a letter in handwriting she didn't recognize. "The survey map is in the other place," he said, "with the gold." "Then put the map here," she said, "and leave the gold where it is. If someone searches the obvious hiding place and finds only gold, they've got a problem, because they can't move enough gold on foot without tracks and time, and they don't know if you're 2 hours out or 20 minutes. They might take some, but the map is what they need, and it won't be where they think it is." Griffin was quiet for a long time. "You have a methodical mind," he said. "I've had a lot of time to think," she said. "When people don't talk to you at meals, you think instead." He moved the map that afternoon. Clara watched him do it and memorized the location from a different angle than the one he used so that she could access it from 2 directions if she needed to. That night she lay awake longer than usual, listening to the mountain, trying to learn its nighttime language. What sounds belonged to it and what sounds didn't. An owl. The creek sound carrying up from the drainage, the horses in the lean-to, wind in the high timber, that constant breathing. She was getting better at separating the sounds. Better, but not good. Good would take months. She hoped they had months. They had 11 days. The attack came on a night in early December when the cold had set in with a finality that made the previous cold feel tentative by comparison, when the temperature after dark fell to the kind of number that had no comfortable way to be described and simply had to be survived. It came on a night when Griffin was inside, which was the first thing that went differently than Clara had been imagining it. She had been imagining it as a daytime event, a trapline event, something that happened while she was alone. She had not been imagining what it would look like when both of them were here. She was asleep, and then she wasn't, with the particular completeness of someone whose body has learned to treat unusual sounds as emergencies. She was sitting up before she was fully conscious, and in the 2 seconds it took to become fully conscious, she had identified the sound. Horses. Not their horses. Different rhythm, different number, coming from the east. She put her hand on Griffin's shoulder before she spoke. He was already awake. "East," she whispered. "I hear it," he said. They moved in the dark with the particular efficiency of people who have spent weeks practicing where everything is, where the rifles are, where the boots are, where to stand and where not to stand relative to the windows when there might be someone outside looking in. Clara had not planned these practices consciously. They had accumulated as natural consequences of paying attention in a place where attention had consequences. She had the second rifle in her hands before Griffin had his boots on. "Stay back from the window," he said, very low. "I know." There was no more sound from outside. The horses had stopped. That was, in some ways, worse than if they'd kept coming. Griffin moved to the window and looked through the gap in the shutter. A 6-inch horizontal gap, deliberate, that gave a narrow view of the east approach. Clara moved to the other window on the north wall and did the same. She could see nothing in the direction of the lean-to except the darkness that wasn't quite absolute. The snow gave back enough starlight to see shapes, but shapes only. The difference between a tree and a man requiring the kind of distinction that total darkness prevents. "2 horses," Griffin said, very quiet. "Tied to the aspen at the drainage. I can see the shapes. The men aren't with them." "No." She turned back to the north window. The first thing she heard was a footstep in the snow. One deliberate, careful step, the sound of a boot placed with the specific intention of minimizing noise, which, on the hard snow crust of a December night, was not quite achievable. Then a second. Then nothing. Then someone hit the door. Not knocked. Hit. A hard, flat impact. The sound of something heavy slammed against it. The bar held. Griffin had made sure of the bar before they slept, and Clara understood now that he had always made sure of the bar, that this had been part of his nightly routine long before the boot prints. "Griffin Hale." The voice from outside was male, unhurried, carrying the particular quality of a man who has decided he is in control of a situation. "We don't want trouble. Open the door, and we can talk about a business arrangement." Clara looked at Griffin. His face was unreadable. "Who are you?" Griffin said loudly, without moving toward the door. A pause. "Men with an interest in the same business you've been running up here, interested in coming to an understanding." "What kind of understanding?" "Well, the kind that involves you leaving the mountain with what you can carry and us taking over the operation. We've got the paperwork filed in Milford." Claims registered as of last week. Clara felt something go cold in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. You're lying, Griffin said, calm, flat. Am I? You can check in Milford, Purcell's survey, filed under a company name, Crow & Associates, Land Development. A pause that felt deliberate. Ring any familiar names? Silas Crow. Clara had known it, had anticipated it, had built the logic of it in her own mind over the past 2 weeks. But hearing the name said aloud in the dark of the cabin on a December night still hit her like a physical thing, a cold hand on the sternum, pressing. Griffin said nothing. The woman, the voice outside said, and something changed in its quality. Something came into it that hadn't been there before. Something that Clara's body recognized before her mind did. A tone that was simultaneously dismissive and threatening, the tone of a man who expects a certain kind of person to behave in a certain kind of way because they always have before. Clara Whitmore, isn't it? Roy Whitmore's girl from Black Hollow. She said nothing. She kept her eyes on the north window. That man used you, the voice said. Brought you up here because he needed someone to manage the cabin while he mines. You think he came to Black Hollow for you specifically? He came because he needed cheap labor with no other options. A pause. Come out. We'll take you back to the settlement. You don't have to be part of whatever happens here. She felt Griffin look at her from across the room. She did not look back at him. She looked at the north window. I'm fine where I am, she said, loud enough to carry through the door. A silence. Then the second voice, different, shorter, with an edge that the first one didn't have, said something she couldn't make out, directed not at the cabin, but at the first speaker. Then a different sound. Glass. The east window. Clara was already moving before she understood why. Some part of her that wasn't in the business of waiting for instructions had heard the sound and made the decision, and her body had executed it before the thought completed. She went sideways, away from the north window she'd been standing near, toward the center of the room, and the north window shutter exploded inward as something heavy came through it. Not a person, a rock, a heavy piece of branch, and hit the floor where she'd been standing and slid into the base of the wall. At the same moment, the east window went, Griffin's side, and a man came through it. Not the whole man at once. The arm first, reaching for the shutter bar, and then Griffin was there, and what happened next was very fast and very loud, and not clean in any way that a story would make it. Griffin caught the arm and pulled, and the man came through the window frame wrong, half-folded, and the sound he made was the sound of someone who had expected to be in control of the next 5 seconds and discovered he was not in control of any of them. The door hit its bar again. Harder. Griffin, Claire said. I'm here. His voice was tight but level. The man from the window was on the floor and not getting up. Not dead, she thought, but done for the moment. Griffin was breathing hard. He'd taken something across the left forearm. She could see that without seeing it clearly, the way he was holding it. How bad? She said. Not bad. The window frame. The door hit its bar a third time, and this time something in the bar mechanism shifted. Not failed, not yet, but shifted, a sound of strain that didn't belong. They're going to break it, she said. Yes, he said. The rifle, she said. Yes, he said. She raised the rifle and she pointed it at the door, and she did what he had told her about the stillness. She found the stillness inside herself, the held breath, the moment between the exhale and the next inhale. And she thought about what he'd said about lines and about the one that was already crossed, and she fired through the door, not at the door, through it. At an angle, high, the shot designed to tell the person on the other side that the person on the inside was serious and capable and not done. The impact against the door stopped. Silence. Then footsteps. Retreating, fast, toward the east where the horses were. Clara lowered the rifle. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this the way you notice things in the immediate aftermath of something intense, with a kind of flat, clear attention that hasn't caught up to what just happened. You fired through the door, Griffin said. You said warning shot first, she said. I said over their head. The door is between their head and me, she said. I made it work. He looked at her for a long moment. The man on the floor moaned. Neither of them addressed this immediately. Are you hurt? Griffin said. No, you. My arm. It's shallow. He moved toward the man on the floor who was large and unfamiliar to Clara. Not one of the men from Black Hollow. No one she recognized. Hired. Sent up from somewhere below. He had a pistol on him that Griffin removed with efficient care. Is he, Clara started, alive? He hit the window frame wrong when I pulled him through. His shoulder. Griffin checked him with the brisk attention of a man who has some practical knowledge of injury. He'll need help getting down the mountain, but he'll get there. The other one, Clara said. The voice. Gone, Griffin said. He straightened up. I heard them go. They'll go to Silas. Yes. And come back with more men, or with something legal, or both. She looked at Griffin. The claim in Milford. If they've actually filed, it complicates things significantly. He moved to the window, carefully, staying to the side, not presenting himself to the open frame. Outside, the snow received the starlight and gave it back unchanged, and there was no movement. The horses at the drainage were gone. I need to see the filing. I need to see what Purcell's survey says, and whether it matches my claim, and whether there's enough difference that a territorial court would sort it in my favor. You need to go to Milford, Clara said. Yes. Now, tonight or before first light. She looked at the man on the floor. He's their proof that they were here. You take him down, you have a witness to what they did. You get to Milford first. Griffin stared at her. Tonight is 20 degrees below nothing. I know, she said. How long to the first shelter station? 6 hours in good conditions. Is this man well enough to ride? With his shoulder, it'll hurt, but yes. Then you tie him to his horse and you go, Clara said. I'll stay. Clara. I fired through a door tonight, she said. I know where the map is. I know where the gold is. I know where the second rifle is and how to use it. She looked at him directly. You said I was capable of surviving this mountain. I need you to mean that. He stood in the damaged cabin with the cold coming in through both broken windows and the fire still burning in the hearth because they'd built it right before they slept. And he looked at her the way he had been increasingly looking at her over the past weeks. Not the trying to understand look anymore, but something that had moved past understanding into a territory that neither of them had named yet. If anyone comes, he said, do not answer the door. I know. Fire the rifle from the window on the east side. The angle gives you cover. I know. You showed me. The man might have friends we don't know about. I know. Clara. He stopped. He looked at her hands, which were still wrapped around the rifle, steady. I'll be back in 3 days. 4 at the outside. I'll be here, she said. He moved toward the door. Then he stopped and turned back, and he said something that she had not expected, not in its directness, not in this moment. I don't know what I would do with someone who wasn't you. In this place. Clara looked at him. Something moved in her chest. The same thing that had shifted that first night, but further now, less tentative. Go to Milford, she said. Come back with legal paper. That's what I need from you right now. He went. She barred the door after him and stood in the cold cabin with the broken windows and the hired man on the floor beginning to come back to fuller consciousness. And she went to the woodpile and she found 2 pieces of flat timber left over from the autumn repairs that Griffin had pointed out to her 2 weeks ago, saying he'd get to them eventually, and she nailed them over the east window with the hammer she knew where to find and the nails she knew where to find, because she had spent 3 weeks learning this place the way she had always learned things. Completely, stubbornly, as though her life depended on it. Her life depended on it. She went to the north window next. The man on the floor said, Who are you? I'm the woman who lives here, Clara said, without stopping what she was doing. Lie still. You've hurt your shoulder and you're not going anywhere until morning. Where's gone, she said. And you're going to answer some questions for me about Silas Crow before you go anywhere yourself. So get comfortable. She put the last nail in the window board and turned around and looked at the man on her floor, and he looked back at her with the expression of someone who had expected a very different kind of person to be here, and Clara thought, good, let him look. She pulled a chair to the center of the room and sat down with the rifle across her knees and the fire behind her and the cold December mountain all around the cabin, holding them both inside it, and she waited for morning the way she had waited for most things in her life, with her eyes open and her hands still and the full weight of her attention applied to the thing in front of her. She did not sleep. She did not need to. The man's name was Doyle. He didn't offer this voluntarily. Clara got it the way she got most things she needed, by waiting, by watching, by asking the question once, and then letting the silence do the rest of the work. Silence was a tool she had more practice with than most people, and she had learned a long time ago that it made a certain kind of man deeply uncomfortable in a way that direct pressure didn't. Doyle was that kind of man. He was somewhere in his late 30s, broad through the chest, with the specific weathering of someone who worked outdoors for money rather than conviction. His shoulder had gone wrong when Griffin pulled him through the window. She could see the shape of it wasn't right, the left side sitting lower and forward than it should, and he was managing the pain by going very still, which gave him the superficial appearance of cooperation even when he wasn't actually cooperating. "Crow hired you in Milford," Clara said. It wasn't a question. Doyle looked at the rifle across her knees. "Helena," he said. Crow was in Helena. His man was. Fella named Garrett, runs errands for Crow and his business people. He shifted slightly and the pain showed on his face before he controlled it. Offered good money for a simple job. What was the job exactly? Scout the location, confirm the survey matched what was actually there. Report back. He paused. Nobody said anything about a woman. Nobody said anything about me, Clara said, or nobody told you about me. He looked at her steadily. Second one. So Crow knew I was here. Doyle said nothing, which was its own answer. Clara turned this over carefully. Crow had known about her, had sent men up anyway. Had included the speech through the door about being used, about coming out, about being taken back to the settlement, and had meant for it to work. Had expected that it would work. Had built his plan around the assumption that Clara Whitmore would hear a familiar voice telling her she didn't belong somewhere and she would believe it. She thought about the flower on the frozen ground, about the sound of that crowd. 26 years of material for Silas Crow to work with, and he'd used every last piece of it, and it had still not been enough. "The claim in Milford," she said. "Is it actually filed?" Doyle considered his options. She watched him do it. The calculation behind his eyes, what she could use against him versus what he could withhold, whether the man with the damaged shoulder in the cold cabin was better served by talking or by silence. "Filed 3 weeks ago," he said finally. "Garrett took the survey and registered it under Crow and Associates. They've got a territorial solicitor who cleaned up the language." He looked at her. "It's legal. That's what they told me." "Legal is a flexible word," Clara said. "That's what solicitors are for," he said, and there was a trace of something almost wry in it, the dark humor of a man who has done enough questionable work for enough questionable people to have developed a philosophical relationship with the concept of legality. "The survey Purcell drew," Clara said. "How accurate is it?" "Accurate enough to file on. Whether it matches the actual ground well enough to hold up against a competing claim," he stopped. "You'd need someone who knows land law better than me." "Griffin knows land law." "Then why hasn't he filed?" It was a fair question and not a comfortable one. Clara had been sitting with it since Griffin left. She knew the shape of the answer, that Griffin had been up here alone, that paperwork required going to Milford, that Milford was 3 days down and 3 days back, and the trap line didn't run itself. But the shape of an answer wasn't the same as an answer that would satisfy a territorial court. "He's filing now," she said. That's where he went. Doyle absorbed this. His expression shifted slightly. The recalculation of a man who understood that the timeline he'd been operating on had changed. "Crow isn't going to let this go," Doyle said. Not a threat. More like information offered by someone who had decided that being informative was better for his shoulder than being difficult. "He's put money into this. Solicitor fees, survey costs, hiring men. He doesn't walk away from money he's already spent." "I know what Silas Crow is," Clara said. "I've known him all my life." Doyle looked at her with the first genuine curiosity he'd shown. "How's that?" "We're from the same settlement." A pause. "Black Hollow." "Yes." He looked at her differently after that. with the specific recalibration of a man who had arrived expecting a certain kind of situation and was discovering it was a different kind. He said the woman up here was nobody, that she wouldn't be a problem. Clara let that sit in the air for a moment. I'd like you to remember, she said evenly, that you are sitting on my floor with a dislocated shoulder because you came here in the middle of the night. Doyle had the grace to look away. She kept him through the night and into the morning, not unkindly. She gave him water and a piece of dried meat, and she didn't tie him because his shoulder made escape its own deterrent. And when the light came up gray and thin, she helped him onto the horse that had come back to the lean-to sometime in the dark hours, horses having more practical sense than their riders about staying near shelter in December. She helped him with the length of rope across his body to keep the shoulder immobile for the descent. "You'll need someone to put that shoulder back in when you reach the settlement," she said. "I know," he said. He looked down at her from the horse with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. "For what it's worth, it's not worth anything yet," she said. "If Crow sends more men up this mountain, I'll know who told him the situation and what I know. And I'll tell the marshal in Milford the same." He understood her. She could see that he understood her. He rode east. Clara watched him go until the trees took him, then went back inside and rebuilt the fire and stood at the repaired east window. The boards she'd nailed were rough but solid, and looked at the daylight arriving over the mountain with the slow, indifferent quality of light that doesn't know or care what kind of night preceded it. 3 days. 4 at the outside. She had work to do. She ran the trap line herself on the second day, not the full line. She didn't know it well enough yet, didn't have Griffin's certainty about the angles and the approaches, and she wasn't going to pretend she did. But the near section, the 8 traps within a mile of the cabin that she had walked with him enough times to know, she ran those. She reset 2 that had sprung empty, retrieved a fox from a third, and found the 4th tampered with in a way that took her a moment to understand. The trap had not been sprung. It had been sprung and reset. Imperfectly. The mechanism was seated slightly wrong in a way that she recognized from her own first attempt, the way it felt when the seat wasn't fully engaged, but reset, deliberately, by someone who wanted it to look undisturbed. She crouched over it in the snow and looked at the area around it. The snow had been disturbed in a radius of several feet and then smoothed over, but the smoothing had been done with something flat, a piece of bark maybe, or a glove, and the pattern of the smoothing was directional in a way that natural snow movement wasn't. Someone had been here since the previous morning, after Doyle left. Someone who hadn't come down from the east this time. She followed what she could read of the sign north carefully, keeping her own tracks separate from what she was following, and she lost it after 100 yards where the snow was shallower under a dense stand of fir and the ground told her less. She stood there in the trees for a moment and thought. 1 man, she thought, or possibly 2 moving in the same track deliberately, which was harder to do but not impossible. Coming from the north now, not the east. They had changed direction after the previous night went wrong. She went back to the cabin. She checked the bar on the door. She checked the boarded windows. She brought extra wood inside from the lean-to so she wouldn't need to go out after dark. She loaded the second rifle and stood it in the corner of the cabin nearest the east window. She loaded the primary rifle and kept it with her. Then she sat down at the table and thought about what she knew. Crow had men on the mountain. More than 2, apparently, unless Doyle and his partner had doubled back after she let Doyle go, which was possible but seemed unlikely given Doyle's shoulder. Someone was still watching the cabin, still measuring. Why hadn't they moved yet? She turned this question over for a long time, looking at it from different angles, the way she had learned to look at things when she was a girl, and the only entertainment available to her was the inside of her own head. They had the numbers, presumably. They had found the general location. They had a filed claim that, legal or not, gave them a piece of paper to wave at anyone who questioned them. What were they waiting for? The survey map. She came to this conclusion slowly and then with total certainty. The survey Purcell had drawn was a copy. She knew this from what Griffin had said, that Purcell's survey was the one filed in Milford, which meant Purcell had given Crow's people a copy, or they had gotten one somehow. But a copy made from memory, or made in the field under time pressure, or made by a man who talked when he drank. A copy like that would have gaps, imprecisions, places where the actual ground and the surveyed ground didn't match well enough to be certain. They needed the original, or they needed to find the veins directly by searching, and the original was in the stone cavity at the base of the chimney. Clara looked at the fireplace. She got up and moved the stone and took the tin box out and opened it and looked at Griffin's survey map. The handwriting she had studied enough in the past weeks to recognize even when she couldn't read all of the notations. The careful lines of a man who is precise in the way that people are precise when precision is a matter of survival. She took it to the table. She was not a surveyor. She did not have Griffin's knowledge of the mountain's geography in the granular, embodied way that came from 8 years of walking it in all seasons. But she could read a map in the basic sense, and she could identify the cabin's location on this one, and she could follow the lines that marked the drainage and the ridge and the upper approach and the vein locations that were marked with Griffin's particular shorthand. She thought for a long time. Then she found a blank piece of paper in the tin box. There were 3 sheets, packed in for exactly this kind of purpose, because Griffin was that kind of thinker. And she began to make a copy. Not an accurate copy, a plausible copy. One that preserved enough of the real geography to look credible, that included the cabin and the ridge and the drainage in their correct relationships. But that moved the vein markers. Not wildly, just enough. Northwest of where they actually were, into an area she had walked enough to know was geologically different, harder, less likely to hold what the map suggested it held. She was not sure this would work. She was not sure the men outside knew enough about the mountain to read the difference between the real location and a false one. She was not sure they would find this copy even if she positioned it to be found. She was not sure of a great many things, but she was alone on a mountain in December with armed men in the trees and 4 or 5 days until Griffin came back. And the thing she had that they didn't was this cabin and this fire, and 4 weeks of learning this place with the full attention of a woman who had spent her life preparing, without knowing it, for exactly this kind of necessity. She finished the copy as the afternoon light went thin and gold through the boarded windows. She put it in a different place than the real map. Not the obvious hiding place behind the wall plank, but not the chimney stone either. She put it in the pocket of Griffin's spare coat, the one that hung on a nail by the door, the one that was visible immediately when the door opened. Not shoved deep in the pocket, just resting there, as though someone had put it somewhere quick and not quite thought through. She put the real map back in the chimney stone. Then she moved the stone back and sat down by the fire and waited. They came on the 3rd night. Not through the windows this time. They tried the door first, quietly. She heard the bar rattle with that specific microsound of someone testing resistance before committing to force, and she was already on her feet with the rifle before the testing turned into pushing. 2 of them, she thought, from the sound. Different from the previous attack. This was quieter, more considered. Someone had learned from what happened to Doyle. "I know you're in there," a different voice from the previous one. Older, more careful. "We're not here to hurt anyone, we just want to look around." Clara said nothing. "We have a legal right to survey this claim. It's filed property." She waited. "Ma'am." The voice tried a different register, almost conciliatory, almost reasonable. "Your man is gone. He's not coming back for days, we know that. There's no reason for this to be difficult." She moved to the east window, carefully, the way Griffin had shown her, keeping to the side of the frame. Through the gap between the boards she had nailed up, she could see the approach from the east, and she could see one man, which meant the second man was somewhere she couldn't see, and that was the information that mattered most. "Show me the filing document," she said loudly. A pause. "What?" "You said you have a legal right. Show me the document. Slide it under the door." Another pause. Longer. She heard them consult in low voices. Not the words, just the rhythm of consultation, the back and forth of 2 people deciding something together. A folded paper appeared under the door. She did not go to get it. "I can't read it from here," she said. "Put it in front of the window, east window." More consultation. Then the paper appeared in the gap between the boards, pressed against it from outside. the words visible in the dim light. She read what she could. Territory of Montana, land filing, survey reference number, Crow and Associates. The language was formal and had clearly been written by someone who knew what land filing language was supposed to sound like. Whether it was legitimate or not, she couldn't tell. But she had made Griffin show her the survey map enough times to know his handwriting, and the survey reference on this document was in a different hand, a copying hand, a hand transcribing rather than originating. This references a survey by someone named Purcell, she said. That's right. Purcell is dead. The survey is still valid. A copied survey filed by a third party referencing a dead man's work. She kept her voice level. That's going to be an interesting conversation in a territorial court. Silence. Ma'am? The conciliatory voice was losing some of its conciliation. We don't want to damage anything or hurt anyone. Let us look at what's here and we'll leave. No, she said. Ma'am, I said no. She shifted the rifle in her hands. I've got 2 rifles in here and I know how to use both of them, and I am not going to open this door. What I'm going to do is write down the reference number on your document, and when my husband gets back from Milford with the marshal, that number is the first thing he's going to check. The word marshal did what she had intended it to do. She heard it land in the silence outside and change the quality of the silence. Your husband went to Milford, the voice said. Yesterday, she said. He took your friend Doyle with him. Doyle had some interesting things to say about Garrett and Crow and Associates. This was partially true, partially extrapolated from what Doyle had told her, and she delivered it with the same flat certainty she used for things she knew completely. So whatever Crow's man Garrett told you about this being uncomplicated, I'd start reconsidering that. A longer silence. She could hear them, or hear the absence of them, the specific quality of 2 men standing very still, trying to decide something. Then footsteps. Retreating. She kept the rifle up for 20 more minutes after the sound of horses faded east. Then she lowered it and sat down on the floor of the cabin, right where she was, and put her back against the wall and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this with something like detached interest. They had not shaken before or during, only now, in the aftermath, the body presenting its invoice for what the mind had borrowed from it. She sat there for a while and let them shake. Then they stopped, and she got up, and she put the fire right, and she did not sleep, but she rested, which was the closest thing available. Griffin came back on the 4th day. She heard the horse before she saw him, and she was at the window before the thought completed, and then she saw the shape coming through the trees from the south, the big dark bay, and Griffin's silhouette on it, and behind him a second horse, and on the second horse a person who was not Doyle. She unbarred the door. He came through it with the cold on his coat and ice in his beard, and he looked at the boarded east window and the boarded north window, and the wear on her face that 4 days alone on the mountain in December will produce, and he said, "Tell me." "Doyle first," she said. "Then me." The person behind him was a woman in her 50s, solid and capable looking, with a marshal's deputy badge pinned to her coat and an expression that suggested she had seen a great many situations and was prepared to see one more. Her name was Agnes Whitfield, and she explained while Clara put water on the stove, the deputy marshal for the Milford district, and she had come because the marshal himself was handling a situation in the south of the territory, and she was the person available. And she had come quickly because what Griffin Hale had shown her in Milford was, in her assessment, a land fraud case with enough documentation to be worth the 3-day ride. "The original survey," Agnes said, sitting at the table with her gloves off. "You have it." "Yes," Clara said, "and the copy filed in Milford. References work Purcell did, but Purcell talked when he drank, and whoever got the information didn't get all of it correctly. The vein locations on the filed survey are off by enough that it would matter in court." She paused. "I spent 4 days verifying this." Agnes looked at her with the sharp attention of someone assessing a witness. "How do you know what's on the filed survey?" "The men Crow sent showed it to me through the window 2 nights ago." Clara went to the tin box and unfolded the paper she'd copied down the filing number on. "This reference. And I have their survey copy in Griffin's spare coat pocket." Agnes looked at Griffin. Griffin looked at Clara. "The spare coat," he said. "I made it findable," she said, "in case they came back and found it and left before I could stop them. The vein locations on that copy are wrong. I changed them when I made it." The room was quiet. "You made a false copy of the survey to mislead them," Agnes said. "I made a copy," Clara said carefully, "with some inaccuracies." "Yes." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then something moved across her face that was professional and controlled, but was, underneath that, the particular expression of a woman who found something genuinely impressive and was not going to say so officially. "I'll need to take the original survey as evidence." "You can have it," Clara said. "There's also this." She went to the table and laid out the notes she had made over 4 nights. The timeline, the events, the names, Doyle's account of Garrett and Crow and Helena, the filing document number, the description of both incursions in as much detail as she could reconstruct. She had written it in the plain, functional style she used for everything, without drama, just sequence and fact. Agnes read it. She read the whole thing without speaking, turning the pages with the careful attention of someone who understood that the shape of a legal case was built from exactly this kind of material. When she was finished, she looked at Clara and said, "How long did it take you to write this?" "I had time," Clara said. Griffin said nothing. He was still looking at her with that expression that had moved past understanding, the one neither of them had named yet. And it was fuller now than it had been before he left, as though 4 days away had finished some internal calculation that 4 weeks together had been building toward. Agnes Whitfield stayed 2 days. She took the original survey and the false copy and Doyle's account, as Clara had transcribed it, and the filing document number and the notes, and she wrote her own report at the table on the second evening with a methodical thoroughness that Clara respected. She told them that the filed claim in Milford would be challenged on the grounds of fraud, a copied survey filed without the originating surveyor's consent or verification, referencing a dead man's work, submitted by a party with documented history of attempting to obtain the location by force. She told them it would take time. Territorial courts were not fast. She told them Silas Crow would likely not be personally charged unless Garrett gave him up, which was possible but depended on how much Garrett valued his own situation versus Crow's. She told them to get the original claim filed under Griffin's name with her as a witness before she left, which they did, Griffin signing and Clara signing as co-claimant, which was Agnes's suggestion and which Griffin agreed to without hesitation and which Clara absorbed with the quiet weight of something that has been said without being said. Agnes left on the 3rd morning. They watched her ride south, and then stood in the cold outside the cabin for a moment in the specific silence that follows the departure of a functional stranger who has been, briefly, an important presence. "Co-claimant," Clara said. "It makes legal sense," Griffin said. He was looking south still, at the empty trail. "Is that the only reason?" He looked at her. The cold was between them and the mountain was around them, and the light was the thin, hard, honest light of a December morning that didn't soften anything. "No," he said. She nodded once. She went back inside. He followed. January came down on them with a weight that Clara had not been prepared for, even though she had been preparing. The cold of December had felt serious. The cold of January felt personal. The kind of cold that wanted something from you, that pressed against every piece of insulation you had and found the gaps. She added a second layer of chinking to the worst wall herself, on a day when the temperature had risen enough to work the material, standing on a stool she'd made from 2 stacked supply boxes and pressing the mixture into the gaps with her fingers while Griffin was on the trapline. She had started going with him twice a week. Not every day. The cabin required its own work, the constant maintenance of a small structure keeping 2 people alive in a large, indifferent wilderness, and that work was real and took time. But twice a week she went with him, and she was getting better at reading the line, better at the animals, at the signs, at the specific intelligence of a landscape that communicated everything if you knew how to listen. She was also, by January, visibly pregnant. She had known since before Griffin left for Milford. She had not said it during that time because she needed to be clear with herself about it first. Needed to sit with it alone and understand what it meant and what it didn't mean before she put it into the world. She told him on a Tuesday evening with the same directness she used for everything, and he sat with it for a long time, the way he sat with important information. And then he said, "Are you well?" "Yes," she said. "I'm well. Is there anything you need?" "Information about what to expect," she said, "and for you to not treat me differently on the trap line." "I'll try on the second one," he said. "I can't promise." "Try hard," she said. He did try. He didn't entirely succeed. There were accommodations he made that she noticed and didn't always argue with, because some of them were reasonable, and some of them she was too tired to fight about, and she had learned to pick those battles. But he asked her more often what she needed rather than deciding what she needed, which was, in her experience, the more important thing. February brought 3 more incursions. Not direct attacks, not after what had happened in December, but signs. Boot prints in new places. A trap she was nearly certain had been interfered with. A shadow on the ridge at the wrong time of day that was there and then wasn't. Crow had not given up. But he had also not come himself. He sent men, and the men came and looked and retreated. Griffin thought this was because Agnes Whitfield's report had given Crow's solicitor a problem to manage, and that while the solicitor managed the problem, Crow was holding back from anything that could be characterized as escalation. Clara thought this was partially true, and also that Crow was waiting for something. She thought he was waiting for spring. She thought about this and didn't say it for a while, and then she said it. Griffin listened. He was at the table with his notebook, and he closed it when she started talking, and he listened with the quality of attention he gave to the mountain, fully, practically, without interrupting. "He thinks winter does the work for him," she said. "He thinks we can't hold out all winter. He thinks one of us gets sick, or one of the traps goes wrong, or the cold gets to us, and by spring he's got a weakened claim and a weakened argument on the other side." She looked at the fire. "And he's thinking about the baby." Griffin looked at her. "He knew I was here," she said. "Doyle told me that. Crow specifically knew." She turned to look at Griffin. "He's counting on it. A pregnant woman on a mountain in winter, miles from any settlement doctor. He's counting on that being the thing that makes you come down." The cabin was very quiet for a moment. "I'm not coming down," Griffin said. His voice was flat. "I know," Clara said, "but I need us to talk about what happens in the spring, when Crow is out of legal options and his solicitor can't hold him back anymore and he decides to come himself." Griffin's jaw tightened. He looked at the boarded east window. They had done it properly now, real boards with real joinery, not the emergency work she'd done at 3 in the morning. "He won't come himself," he said. "Crow doesn't get his hands dirty." "He didn't used to," Clara said, "but he's put enough money into this now that the calculation has changed, and he has a specific feeling about me." She said this carefully, without drama. "He's always needed to be right about me, about what I am, about what I'm capable of." She paused. "I am a significant inconvenience to his self-image, and men like him don't carry that kind of thing well." Griffin looked at her for a long time. "You've thought about this more than you've said." "I think about most things more than I say," she said. He leaned back in his chair. The fire said what the fire says. Outside, January pressed its case against the walls. "Then we prepare for spring," he said. "What do you need?" Clara looked at him, at this man who had walked into Black Hollow one morning and done one specific thing that nobody else had thought to do, which was to look at her and see what was actually there, and felt, not for the first time, the peculiar vertigo of being in a life that was entirely different from the one she had been given, a life she was building herself, day by day, chink by chink, trap by trap. In the cold and the dark and the beautiful indifferent wilderness of a mountain that had no opinion about what she deserved, and therefore left her entirely free to determine it herself. "Tell me everything you know about spring on this mountain," she said. "The terrain, the trails, where men on horses can come from and where they can't, where we can see them coming from far enough away to matter." He told her. She listened. The baby moved, which it had been doing for 2 weeks now, and Clara put her hand flat against her side without interrupting Griffin and without making anything of it, just registered the fact of it, the small interior life making its presence known in the particular way it had, and then went back to listening because Griffin was talking about the east approach, and there was information in what he was saying that she was going to need. Spring came to the mountain the way most true things come. Not announced, not dramatic, but gradual, and then suddenly undeniable. The first sign was the creek below the East Ridge, which had been silent under ice since November and began, in the second week of March, to make a sound again. Just a sound at first, a low, intermittent murmur beneath the frozen surface, water remembering what it was supposed to do. Clara heard it on a morning when she was outside splitting kindling, and she stopped and listened and thought, there it is. The thing they'd been waiting for. The thing Crow had been waiting for. She was 8 months along by then. She moved differently than she had in December. Everything took longer. Everything required more consideration, and her body had opinions about activities that it had previously allowed without comment. She split the kindling anyway, in shorter sessions, and she didn't apologize to anyone about it, including herself. Griffin had spent the winter doing two things simultaneously, maintaining their survival on the mountain and building their legal case from the inside out. He had written 14 letters to Agnes Whitfield, which Clara had helped him draft, and Agnes had written back 9 times, and the correspondence had the shape of a case being constructed carefully, documenting each incursion, each piece of evidence, building the picture of what Crow and Associates had done and attempted. The territorial court date had been set for May. Helena. 3 judges. The fraud case on the filed claim, and alongside it, Griffin's properly witnessed original claim, now registered in Milford under both their names. March was when the incursions stopped, not gradually, all at once, like a sound being cut off. After months of signs, boot prints, tampered traps, shadows on the ridge, the mountain went quiet in a way that was different from the winter quiet. The winter quiet was natural. This quiet was the quiet of something being held back, and Clara trusted it less than she had trusted the noise. "He's in Helena," she said one evening. "Crow. He's there already, working the situation from that end." Griffin looked up from the letter he was reading, Agnes's most recent, which had arrived via a supply runner they'd arranged twice monthly through the winter, a young man from a settlement to the south named Peter, who was reliable and asked no questions. "Agnes says his solicitor filed a challenge to our registration." "On what grounds?" "Procedural. They're arguing that Agnes didn't have the authority to witness a land claim registration in Milford, that it had to be done through the Helena office." He set the letter down. "It's not going to hold. Agnes already has the counterargument prepared, but it delays the May date." "By how much?" 6 weeks? Maybe 8. Clara sat with this. The baby shifted, which it did constantly now. An interior presence with strong opinions about available space. She had stopped being startled by it weeks ago, and now simply accommodated it the way she accommodated everything on this mountain, by adjusting and continuing. 6 weeks after May, she said. "That's July." "Yes." "The baby comes in April." "I know." So Crow's solicitor knows about the baby. They filed the delay knowing it would put the court date after the birth. She looked at the fire. "They think I won't be able to travel to Helena with a newborn. They think Griffin Hale is going to walk into that court without his co-claimant, and it's going to look different than if we both walk in." Griffin's jaw tightened. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "Don't finish that sentence the way you were going to finish it." He closed his mouth. "I will be in Helena in July," she said. "Write back to Agnes and tell her that." He wrote back to Agnes and told her that. The baby came on the 14th of April, which was a Sunday, though Clara only knew this because of the tally on the doorframe. There was a woman, a midwife from the southern settlement named Ruth, who had come up 3 weeks before at Griffin's arrangement, and who had the compact, unflappable quality of someone who had delivered children in difficult circumstances many times before and considered this one, while remote, not the most challenging of her career. It took 14 hours. Clara would not describe those 14 hours as anything other than what they were, the hardest physical work she had ever done, which was a significant statement given the life she had been living. And at the end of them, she was lying in the bunk in the loft that Griffin had rebuilt wider and softer in January for exactly this purpose, and Ruth put a small, loud, extraordinarily opinionated person on her chest. A boy. She looked at him for a long time. Griffin came up the loft ladder and stood at the edge, and looked at both of them, and Clara watched his face do something she had never seen it do before. Not the flat calculation, not the almost smile, not the distance of a man who has learned to keep himself back from things, because things leave. Something opened in it. Something that had been sealed a long time came open, right there on his face, and he didn't try to close it again. He sat on the edge of the bunk, and he put 2 fingers against the baby's fist, and the baby, with the blind, furious instinct of the newly arrived, grabbed them. Griffin made a sound that Clara had never heard from him, short, involuntary. "What's his name?" Ruth said from the ladder, practical and unintrusive. Griffin looked at Clara. "James?" Clara said. It had not been a name she'd thought about consciously, but when Ruth asked it, she knew it, the way she knew some things, completely and immediately, without the intermediate step of deciding. "James Hale." Griffin looked at the baby, at the name being applied to this small, fierce, particular person. "James," he said, trying it. The baby continued to express strong opinions about the world at considerable volume. "He's healthy," Ruth said. "Lungs, especially." "Yes," Clara said. "I noticed." No. Ruth stayed 2 more weeks, which was 2 weeks of invaluable practical knowledge delivered in Ruth's particular style, which was direct and unsentimental and assumed competence rather than teaching toward it. Clara absorbed everything. She was tired in a way she hadn't been before. A deep, cellular tiredness that didn't fully resolve with sleep, but she was functional, and functional was what the mountain required, and she had never needed to be more than functional to do what needed doing. She was standing at the east window on a morning in late April. James asleep in the wooden cradle Griffin had built in February from leftover timber, with the same precise, unshowy competence he brought to everything structural, when she saw the horses. 4 of them. Coming from the east, which was the direction she had told Agnes to watch. She said, "Griffin?" He was outside. She said it at a volume that carried through the wall, and she heard him moving before she'd finished saying it. She counted the horses again. 4 and 4 riders, and one of the riders sat differently from the others. Straighter, cleaner coat, a horse that was better kept than working horses usually were in this country. She knew that posture. She had watched it her whole life across a settlement road, across a general store floor, across the frozen ground where her flour had been dumped. Silas Crow had come himself. She had known he would. She had said so in February, and Griffin had argued it, and she had been right, and she took no satisfaction in this because satisfaction was not what the moment called for. She got James from the cradle and went to the back of the cabin where the light was dim and the sight lines from outside were poorest. She settled him against her shoulder. He was awake and alert in the way of infants who seem to sense atmospheric change. His eyes, dark and unfocused still, moved in the direction of the sound of horses. "Easy," she said, to him or to herself, she wasn't sure. Griffin came through the door and took the situation in one look. Clara against the back wall, the horses visible through the east window, her face telling him what she'd already seen. "Crow," he said. "Yes." He went to the rifle. She said, "Wait." He looked at her. "Let him come to the door," she said. "Let him knock. Don't give him anything to report about being threatened." She shifted James to her other shoulder. "Agnes said the court date is confirmed for July. We have 7 weeks. 7 weeks is not the time to give Crow a story about mountain men with rifles." Griffin stood with his hand on the rifle, and she watched him work through it. The instinct versus the strategy, the wanting to confront versus the understanding that confrontation on Crow's terms was exactly what Crow wanted. He moved his hand off the rifle. They waited. The knock came. Formal. 3 deliberate raps. The knock of a man presenting himself as a reasonable party making a reasonable call. "Hail!" Crow's voice through the door. Controlled, well-modulated, the voice of a man who had spent his life in situations where the voice was a tool. "I've come to talk. No tricks. I have 3 men with me, and they'll stay with the horses." Griffin looked at Clara. She nodded once. He opened the door. Silas Crow stood on the threshold of Griffin Hale's cabin in a good wool coat and good boots, and looked essentially the same as he always had. Handsome in the calculated way of men who have tended their appearance as a professional asset. Confident in the way of men who have rarely been told no and have therefore not developed much capacity for it. He looked at Griffin. Then his eyes moved past Griffin and found Clara against the back wall with the baby on her shoulder, and something happened in his face that was small and quickly controlled, but that Clara, who had been reading Silas Crow's face since she was old enough to be a target for his humor, read clearly. He had not expected the baby to be real yet. He had known about the pregnancy, had built his legal delays around it. But knowing a thing in the abstract and seeing it against a woman's shoulder in a mountain cabin are different kinds of knowing, and the second kind hit him in a way he hadn't prepared for. Clara watched him recover. "Clara," he said. A nod. Civilized. "Silas," she said. "Nice boy," he said, with the specific insincerity of a man paying a social compliment he has no feeling for. "He is," she said. "Come in or don't, but close the door either way." Crow came in. Griffin closed the door. The three of them were in the cabin, and the fire was going, and James made a small sound against Clara's shoulder, and the situation was what it was. "I'll be brief," Crow said, directing this at Griffin, the way he always directed things at the person he considered the relevant party. "The legal situation is complicated and expensive for everyone. I'm prepared to make an offer." "Say it," Griffin said. 30% of the claim. Registered in Milford under a partnership agreement. You keep the cabin and the trap income. We take 30% of whatever comes out of the mine operation, which we fund and run. You don't have to do anything except sign. The cabin was quiet except for the fire and the horses outside and the baby. "No," Griffin said. Crow's expression didn't change exactly, but it adjusted. The offer mode shifted toward something else. "I have a valid filing. You have a fraudulent filing," Griffin said, "based on a copy of another man's work, obtained without consent, filed by a party with no legitimate claim to the survey. Agnes Whitfield has documented evidence of 2 armed incursions on this property. Your man Garrett hired those men." Doyle gave a statement. He looked at Crow steadily. "Your solicitor is good, but he's not good enough to make that case disappear. You know it, and I know it." Crow looked at Griffin for a long moment. Then, for the first time since he'd come through the door, he looked at Clara directly, not past her, at her. "I have to say," he said, with a precision that told Clara he had thought about these exact words, "that I underestimated you." She looked back at him. "I know. I thought—" He stopped. He was not a man who admitted to having thought wrong, and the sentence cost him something. "I thought you'd be gone by the first snow." "I know that too," she said. "You've been busy," he said, and there was something underneath it that was not admiration. Silas Crow didn't do admiration for people he considered beneath him, and a lifetime of decision was too heavy to lift in one cabin on one spring morning. But was adjacent to it, was the thing a man feels when the story he's been telling himself about someone is revealed to be significantly shorter than the actual story. "I've been home," Clara said, simply, without anger, without performance. "I've been doing what you do when you're home, taking care of it." Crow looked at her for another moment. Then he looked around the cabin, at the repaired windows, at the organized stores, at the cradle by the fire, at the rifle on its hooks, at the tally marks on the door frame that she'd kept all winter, 1 mark for each day. A column of small lines that went across the whole lower frame now, more than 100 of them. He looked at the tally marks for a moment longer than he looked at anything else. "The court date is July," he said, looking away from them. Back to Griffin. "July 14th, Griffin said. "I'll have my solicitor contact Agnes Whitfield about a pre-hearing conference." He said this in the tone of a man who is redirecting, who has found the exit from a room he walked into wrong. "There may be a settlement option that doesn't require the full proceeding." "There may be," Griffin said. "If the settlement starts with your name coming off the filing." Crow put his hat back on. He was a man who knew when a negotiation had reached the end of what it was going to achieve in a given session, and he had that knowledge now. He moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at Clara one more time, and she held his eyes, and for a moment they were in Black Hollow again. 2 people from the same small settlement who had understood each other, in their way, better than either had understood most people. but who had made completely different uses of that understanding. "You were always going to be difficult," he said. "Not cruel. Something more complicated than cruel." "I was always going to be capable," she said. "Those aren't the same thing. You just decided they were." He left. She listened to the horses go and didn't move until the sound was entirely gone. And then she sat down on the chair by the fire and held James properly against her front and felt her own heartbeat gradually slow. Griffin stood at the window and watched the horses until they were out of sight. Then he turned around. "A pre-hearing conference," he said. "He's going to settle," Clara said. "He doesn't want to sit in front of 3 territorial judges with what Agnes has on him. His family name is in Helena. His father does business with half the merchants in the territory." She looked down at James, who had gone back to sleep with the profound, self-satisfied completeness of an infant whose needs are currently met. "He'll give up the filing. He'll want something in return, but it won't be the claim." "What will he want?" "For it to go away quietly," she said. "For nobody to pursue the charges beyond the civil question. For Garrett to be the one who takes whatever consequences there are." She shifted James to the crook of her arm. "He'll want to be able to go back to Black Hollow and tell whatever story he needs to tell." Griffin looked at her. "And you're all right with that?" Clara thought about it honestly. She thought about the flower on the frozen ground. She thought about 26 years of a particular kind of daily erosion. She thought about what it would mean to pursue Silas Crow into a criminal proceeding, to make it bigger, to make it the thing that defined the next year, instead of what she was already building. "I want the claim," she said. "I want him off the mountain and off the filing, and I want Agnes's documentation in a place that means he can't try this again. If he gets to walk away with his name intact," she paused, "I won't lose sleep over it. A man like Crow carries what he is everywhere he goes. He doesn't need me to make it heavy." Griffin was quiet for a moment. Outside, the creek below the east ridge was fully running now, the ice gone, the water saying what spring water says, that it has been waiting and now it's done waiting. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "Listen." The settlement came in June. Agnes Whitfield managed it with the same compact, capable efficiency she had brought to everything, and the terms were what Clara had predicted almost exactly. Crow and Associates withdrew the fraudulent filing, paid court costs, and the criminal referral on the armed incursions was set aside provided no further action was taken against the Hale claim. Garrett left the territory. What story Crow told in Helena or in Black Hollow about why he'd left a mountain claim in Montana, that was his to manage. Agnes sent the final documents in a packet that arrived on a Tuesday in late June. The same day, Clara noticed that James had begun to respond to voices with a specific turning of his head, tracking the sound with the focused intention of someone who has identified that sounds, contain information, and is determined to extract it. She read the documents at the table while James investigated the ceiling from his cradle with this new and absorbing project of his. Griffin read them after her. He signed where Agnes had indicated, and Clara signed where Agnes had indicated, and Griffin folded them into the oilcloth in the hidden cavity behind the wall plank, the real one, and reseated the plank, and that was that. "It's done," Griffin said. "The legal part is done," Clara said. "The rest takes longer." He looked at her. "Building a claim into something real takes years," she said. "The survey is ours. The documentation is filed. Now we actually have to do the work." She smiled, which she did infrequently enough that it still registered on his face when it happened. "Which is fine. I'm not opposed to work." "I've noticed," he said. James made a demanding sound from the cradle. They both looked at him. "He wants an audience," Griffin said. "He always wants an audience," Clara said. "He gets that from his father." Griffin turned to look at her with the expression that had replaced most of the others over the months, the one that was still learning to be what it was, still sometimes surprised by itself, the way a door that's been stuck for years is sometimes surprised when it opens easily. "I don't need an audience," he said. "You came into Black Hollow and declared in front of 30 people that you were going to marry me," she said. "You need some kind of audience." He looked at the ceiling in the way of a man making no argument because he has no argument to make. July came in hot and brief the way Montana July does. A month that seems almost surprised to find itself there, wedged between the long cold and the early fall, making the most of its temporary authority. The meadow above the cabin, which had been under snow when Clara arrived, was full and green and alive with things she was still learning to name. Griffin had been teaching her the plants, which were useful and which were decorative and which were neither, just growing because the mountain allowed it, which seemed to him sufficient reason for a thing to exist. She had started to agree with him. On a Thursday in mid-July, Clara walked to the south slope where the sun got in even in January, carrying James on her front in the cloth carrier Ruth had shown her how to make. She had asked Griffin to show her the place, but had wanted to go alone the first time, and he had understood this without her having to explain it. Margaret's grave was marked with a flat stone that Griffin had carried and set, with no inscription because he had not been able to settle on words and finally decided the stone itself was sufficient. The south slope was everything he had described. The angle of the hill meant the light found it first in the morning and held it longest in the afternoon, and in July it was deep with grass and the small mountain flowers that Clara still didn't have full names for. She sat down beside the stone. She didn't have a prepared thing to say. She was not, in general, someone who prepared speeches. She sat for a while with James sleeping against her chest and the mountain doing what the mountain did in July, breathing, expanding, making the particular sounds of a place that has survived another winter and is now fully, unambiguously itself again. After a while she said, "He built this well. The cabin. What you gave him the chance to build, he built it well, and he kept it." She paused. "I'm going to keep it too," she said. "That's what I wanted you to know." The mountain said nothing, which was its answer to everything, and Clara sat a while longer before she got up and walked back toward the cabin where Griffin was doing something structural to the lean-to that she could hear from 200 yards away, the sound of a man improving a thing that already worked because he couldn't help wanting it to work better. James woke as she walked and looked at the sky with his current primary expression, which was intense concentration, as though the sky was something that had been presented to him as a puzzle and he was determined to solve it. "It doesn't solve," she told him. "You just look at it." He considered this and continued looking. She walked back through the July mountain that she had arrived at in winter and did not know and now knew in the way she knew her own hands, imperfectly, with gaps, with whole sections she had yet to learn, but fundamentally and in her body, the way you know something you have survived alongside. She thought about what it had taken. Not the obvious things, not the attacks, not the cold, not the legal fight, not the night she had fired through a door in December and discovered that her hands didn't shake until afterward. Those things had been hard, but they had been legible. Hard in the way things are hard when they require something you didn't know you had, and then you find it and use it, and afterward you understand yourself differently. What it had actually taken was the smaller thing. The thing before the obvious things. It had taken deciding, in the morning light of a damaged settlement road with flour on the frozen ground, not to believe the story that had been told about her for 26 years, not to reject it loudly, not to argue against it, not to perform a different version of herself for an audience. Just, privately, in the part of herself that made actual decisions, to place the story to one side and keep moving. She had not known, at that moment, that Griffin Hale was about to walk out of a general store and pick up her flour sack. She had not known any of what was coming. She had just known that she was tired of carrying someone else's story about her, and that it weighed more than any sack of flour she'd ever lifted, and that she didn't want to carry it anymore. The rest, the mountain, the man, the fight, the child sleeping against her chest, the rest had been the consequence of that one private decision, played out across a hard winter with all the imperfection and difficulty and occasional grace that actual living, as opposed to imagined living, always involves. She had not become someone different. She had become more completely who she already was. That, she thought, was how it worked. Not a transformation, an excavation. You dug down through the layers of what you'd been told you were until you hit something solid, and then you built from there. It was slow and it was unglamorous, and you made mistakes, and the cold got in through the gaps, and there were nights when the thing you were building seemed small against the size of what surrounded it. But you kept building. That was the whole of it. You kept building. Griffin looked up from the lean-to when she came around the corner of the cabin, and he saw whatever was on her face. She wasn't sure what it was, but it was apparently visible. and he set down the tool he was holding. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I went to the south slope." He nodded. He didn't ask about it. He was a man who understood that some things were private not because they were hidden, but because they were complete in themselves, and that respecting this was one of the ways you could love someone without consuming them. She was still learning the word for what they were to each other. The legal papers said co-claimants, and the territorial record said married. They had made it official in February, with Agnes as witness over 2 pages of paperwork, practical as everything they did. But those words were containers, not contents. The contents were harder to name. They were the accumulated weight of watching someone and being watched by them, truly, without the verdict that usually came with being watched. They were the sum of 4 in the morning fire tending and arguments about trapline strategy, and the night Clara had fired through a door, and the morning Griffin had come back from Milford with a deputy marshal and looked at the boarded windows and then at her with the expression of a man who has been afraid of something and discovered the fear was unwarranted. They were everything 2 people build when they build deliberately, without the illusion that it will be easy or that either of them will always be right. James made a sound of displeasure at being still too long. "He's hungry," Clara said. "He's always hungry," Griffin said, "like his mother." "His mother does a great deal of physical work," Clara said. "She requires fuel." She went inside. She fed her son. Outside, Griffin went back to improving the lean-to. The sound of his work steady and purposeful and carrying through the cabin walls the way the creek carried through the summer air. Just there, just constant, the sound of the place they had made. The tally marks on the doorframe had long since filled their section and begun a second column. Clara had stopped counting them individually. It was not necessary anymore. The days were not things to be tracked for the purpose of surviving them. They were simply the days, each one difficult in its own specific way, each one containing something she hadn't known the morning before, each one belonging to a life that was, in all the ways that had ever mattered, entirely her own. She looked at the marks anyway, briefly, as she passed. More than 300 of them now. A winter, a spring, half a summer. She went to the window and looked out at the mountain. Enormous, patient, indifferent, magnificent. And the mountain looked back with the expression it always had, which was no expression at all, just what it was, just the fact of itself. She thought, "It's enough." She thought, "It's more than enough." She went back to her son and her life, and the long, ordinary, extraordinary work of living in a place you have chosen with a person you have chosen, on ground that is yours because you held it when it needed holding. It is never the people who are given things easily who know what those things are worth. It is the people who carried the weight before anyone offered to help, who worked the frozen ground before anyone believed it would yield, who stayed in the room when every reasonable voice said, "Leave." Those people know. Clara Whitmore had known it her whole life. She had just needed a mountain and one honest man and enough silence to finally hear herself think. She had built the rest herself.